Hi, friends. Welcome to Murder Mavens. This is Lynn. And if you'll recall, last week I actually presented the Karen Reed case, and the retrial started today. So I've been watching all of the pretrial motions, and it's been really fascinating to see the case develop. And I actually have a lot of information because I watched the first trial and I watched all the pretrial motions for this one that if you were a juror sitting on this case, you wouldn't and you shouldn't really know all of those details. So I'm coming into this a little bit already with some facts that have kind of already formed in my mind an opinion of Karen Reed's guilt or innocence. And if you're following this case at all, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. And if you're watching the retrial, I would love to know your thoughts as well on how this is going as a comparison to how the first trial went. So I don't know that I'll be able to do a recap every day, but I'm going to try to pop on and do maybe a 15-20 minute recap of each day if I can. I might have to skip a day or two. I generally watch these live trials when they stream during the day as I'm working. And so I'm going to try to find a few minutes each night to just sum up where we're at, what happened that day, and my thoughts, my impressions as the day ends. So today is day one. We had opening statements. Giving the opening statement for the prosecution was Brennan. And I feel like I didn't go back and rewatch the first trial's opening statements, but my general impression is that he told a better story of what happened. Now, in essence, the story is the same. They are still alleging that Karen Reed backed her car into John O'Keefe and then left him for dead. And that hasn't changed, but I do feel like Brennan's opening was tighter in the sense that there wasn't as much extraneous information about the weather and the snow and, all the many people who were there that night. And it just seemed like a lot of names were introduced during maybe not specifically the opening, but throughout the case in the first trial. So this one, though, I kind of feel like he's off to a really good start. He's setting the context for what they are going to try to prove throughout their presentation of the case. And overall, I think that he made a good case for what he thinks happened. On the defense side, quite a bit of a change up in two very big ways that I think are, one of which is very substantial and the other is, I guess, neither good or bad. Alan Jackson was the person who did the opening in the retrial today, and David Yannetti was the person who gave the opening in the first trial. David Yannetti is the local lawyer, and Alan Jackson is actually a lawyer from California, I believe, who is has permission to practice in the state of Massachusetts, and that is so long as there's a local lawyer who is going to be a part of the trial as well. And that just helps them to kind of understand the local state laws. So Alan Jackson gave the opening, and I think they're both really good lawyers. So in that way, that change I don't think is any different, because I feel like both of their openings were pretty effective and easy to listen to, easy to follow. But I think the big difference, this is a huge difference, I feel, and I think it's actually going to get the jurors in the right mindset, because in the first trial, if you recall, or if you watched my Murder Maven's Killer Cards episode number 3, the defense in the first trial, David Yannetti, his first words in the opening statement was Karen was framed. Karen Reed was framed. And I think when you say such a bold statement like that, right away, it begs to be proven. And if you are on trial, if you are accused of committing a crime, you are supposed to be presumed innocent, and it is not your job to prove that innocence. You are innocent until proven otherwise. But when your lawyer gets up and says, you were framed. I think just as a human reflex, we just, the first response is, really? Prove it. Bring the receipts. So I kind of feel like that already put the defense like straight out of the gates in the first trial. And this is just all with hindsight, right? Because we know how it ended that first time around. I think it just made all of the jurors question everything that the defense was saying with a lot more scrutiny, as opposed to what they should be doing is focusing on whether the prosecution is really proving their case. And I think that makes a big difference, because if you're in your mindset, you're questioning one side more or the other, if you are, skeptical of one side out of the gates and less skeptical of the other. I mean, we already have whatever biases we're going to have going into a trial, right? But when the defense attorney puts out such a bold statement like that, I think it's just a natural reflex to think, okay, let's prove that. I want to see you prove that. Where are the receipts? Show me. And in this case, Alan Jackson opened, and it feels like what they are presenting as the defense is that this was a bad investigation, that once they locked into Karen as a suspect, they did not look anywhere beyond that, that all of this transpired on the lawn of a fellow police officer, and there was a reticence, we'll just say, to put it lightly, there was a reticence to involve him. And even if there isn't like a conspiracy to cover things up, there was certainly enough to show that they did not take a hard look at some of the people who feels like if they weren't as if they weren't as part of as influential in that community as they were, maybe the police would have taken a closer look at them. And that just wasn't the case. They didn't really do an investigation. And they were not allowed by prior motions to actually even bring up the fact that, there might be other people who did this. And there's strong evidence to suggest that somebody else committed these crimes. But I think the defense is going to put on enough of a case to kind of lead things that way, and then finally be able to introduce that maybe at trial. So they both, I feel, did fairly good opening statements. I'm no lawyer, I don't know, but just from a layman's perspective, if I were sitting in the jury, I felt like, they're both equally believable, they're both likable, and neither of them seem like they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes or anything. So I think overall that was a good start. The first witness that the prosecution put on was Timothy Nutall. He is a first responder, he's a fireman, and he was actually the person who testified to hearing Karen say, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him," which there was quite a bit of back and forth. And I've watched other trials, and I don't think I've ever seen it presented this way, where, okay, so normally the way it goes is that the prosecution calls a witness, they do their direct examination, and then the defense gets to cross-examine the witness, and so they cross-examine and they ask their series of questions, and then the prosecution gets a rebuttal. They get to kind of clean up whatever damage, so to speak, that the defense was able to do. And usually that's it. Usually it ends there. It's just prosecution, defense, prosecution, and then we go on to the next witness. But it feels like in this courtroom, it ping-ponged back and forth, back and forth, back and forth several times. And I feel like I really, really hope that this isn't a peek into how the rest of the trial is going to be, because I kind of feel like by the end of the ping-ponging, it got to be pretty petty. You know how sometimes when you're having a very heated debate or argument even with somebody, at some point at the very end, you're not even talking about things that matter anymore, but you just want to have the last word. And so by the end, it just becomes very like, petty. It just seems like, why are you even arguing over this? you know? And so to me, that's the overall sense I got of Timothy Nuttall's um his examination, both the direct examination and the cross examination. And basically, he was put on by the prosecution to be the person who essentially gets or hears the confession, so to speak, by Karen Reed of I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And now he is alleging that he heard her say it 3 times, whereas in the first trial, he said that he heard it 2 times. And so yeah, his testimony is now inconsistent with a prior testimony for which he was sworn to tell the truth. So he said it under oath the first time during the first trial that she said I hit him twice. And now he's saying that she said it 3 times. So why the change? And there was something kind of interesting that was hit on, I feel effectively, but really like hammered. And then it kind of felt like beating a dead horse. But Alan Jackson was able to elicit during his cross-examination of Nuttall that he's testified to these facts slightly differently, that his story has changed. And when Jackson asked Nuttall, does your memory get better over time? Or does it fade over time? And it was astonishing that he hemmed and hawed a little bit, but ultimately he said that, yeah, on some things my memory gets better over time. And I kind of feel like anyone who hears that just thinks it's BS. I certainly do. We all know that over time, your memory fades, it alters, you don't really remember things exactly the way that they happened in the first place. But certainly over time, your memory is going to change and it's going to be more suggestive, even, or suggestible, where, maybe you see or hear somebody present it a different way, and then now that becomes your quote memory of that day. So memory, there's been lots of studies on memory, by the way. So, but you don't need to be a scientist to know just the common sense that typically speaking, for most people, our memories do not get better with time. They fade with time. And so I feel my sense with Nuttall overall is that it felt like he was very dug into certain things that just seemingly are not all that consequential, but he was very afraid to own up to even the slightest little bit of anything. And we saw a lot of that in the first trial as well, where if they just own up to it and just, accept it, because ultimately they get hammered so much they have to accept it in the end anyways. If they had just accepted it in the beginning, it would seem less of a big deal. But because they put up a fight, they dig in their heels, and then they ultimately have to backtrack, it looks worse. So one example is, I think on one of the, back and forths, Brennan asked Nuttall, the injuries that you found on John O'Keefe, were they all on the right side? And I'm not exactly sure what that's leading up to or how that supports their case, but it's a question that he asked, right? And so he asked that, and Nuttall says, yes, all of the injuries were on the right side of John O'Keefe's body. So then Jackson gets up and asks him, so earlier you said that there was a hematoma or like a bruise on over the left eye of John O'Keefe, and or there was swelling or something like that. And so Nuttall goes, yeah, when there was, he's like hemming and hawing, and then he's like, yeah, sometimes when there's swelling, it travels. It's like, okay, interesting. And so I just thought that was a kind of amusing way of putting it. But yeah, he was like, so sometimes with injuries, there's swelling and that can travel. And so Alan Jackson asks him again, so then was there a bruise on over the left eye or on the left side of John O'Keefe? And he was like, no. And then he asked, because I think they were nitpicking over words, I think. So, oh, that's what it was. So Brendan was like, "Are there any injuries on John O'Keefe's left side, or were all the injuries on the right side?" And he said, "Yeah, all the injuries were on the right side." And Jackson starts questioning him about this bruise that is on over the left eye. And he goes, "Yeah, there's a bruise on the left eye." So then Jackson asks him, "So are there any injuries on the left side of John O'Keefe's body?" And he says, "No." And then so Jackson has to ask him again, "Okay, but there was a bruise over his left eye, right?" And he goes, "Yeah." "Would you consider a bruise an injury?" Nutall says, "Yes." So then Jackson asks again, "So were there any injuries on the left side?" And Nutall has to say yes. So why did he put up such a fight on this point? He should have just said, "Yeah, I forgot. There is that, but that wasn't like the bulk of the injuries that it looked like he sustained or something." But now that he put up such a fight about it, it just makes him, I feel in my mind, just a very just very not credible overall, because he's fighting tooth and nail over things that we don't know the importance of, but now there's a lot of, in my mind, scrutiny over that detail because he fought so hard to admit to it. And now the natural question is why? When if he had just admitted to it early on and didn't fight it so hard, then it would be like gone out of our memories too. So they did complete his that witness, and he was excused. And then the second witness to be called was Kerry Roberts. Now, Kerry was the person who was in the car with Karen Reed and Jennifer McCabe when they drove around to look for John O'Keefe on that morning after the night out at the bar. And so she was a very likable witness, I remember, from the first time. And from the first trial, actually, I remember they didn't cross-examine her at all. I think because she was so likable, they didn't want to, like, be mean to somebody that it seemed like the jury liked. And so I kind of feel like they sort of left her alone. So it'll be interesting to see if the defense actually cross-examines her this time. They did not get to finish the direct examination before the judge called it a day, and then they had some motions that they needed to debate amongst just the lawyers after the jurors were dismissed for the day. But Kerry Roberts is actually, it's interesting how the prosecution is laying out the case because, with Nutall, they're basically describing the scene. What happened. They're getting out there the fact that Karen Reed, quote, like, admitted to the crime by saying, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." So they're putting the quote confession out there, and now they're backtracking a little bit timeline wise with Kerry Roberts because she gets a call. Panicked Karen Reed calls her, and they decide that they're going to drive around with Jennifer McCabe to look for John. And all we got today was really just background stuff, and that they had just kind of pulled up to discover the body. And that's it. So we didn't really get too much into her. I think there's going to be a lot more on direct tomorrow. Okay, so those are my thoughts for day one. I don't know that I'll be doing a recap every day, but I'll try to if I can. I'm definitely watching every day in the background as I work. But let me know your thoughts. Are you watching the retrial? Did you watch the first trial? If you didn't watch the first trial and you're watching this fresh, I would definitely love your thoughts on this as you're seeing it all unfold for the first time. And if you want to actually get kind of caught up and know what happened in the first case, check out Killer Cards episode 3. That's our episode on Karen Reed. So I give a background on what happened and also a recap of the first trial, what the prosecution's case was in that first trial and what the defense's case was in that first trial. So it'll be really interesting to see how this trial differs. There's definitely, well, the big thing is that the prosecution is being led by Brennan, who is a different prosecutor. He's a special prosecutor brought in to try this case. And on the defense side, there have been several new attorneys added to Karen Reed's team. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this trial unfolds, especially since one of the defense attorneys was actually an alternate juror who sat and listened to all of the testimony during the first trial. But she was an alternate at the end, and so she didn't actually get to sit and deliberate. And so I think she's going to be able to give the defense team a lot of insight into what points that the defense made that came off well and that seemed to work. And because she didn't deliberate with the other jurors in the first trial, she doesn't know ultimately what conversations were had. But I think she's going to have a lot of insight from the juror's perspective, and being a lawyer herself, I think she's going to have some really good recommendations for them. So that concludes my recap and thoughts on day 1. And we do have our next Killer Cards episode. It is Alex Murdaugh on April 28th, so I hope you'll join Wendy and I then for some live crafting and storytelling of the Alex Murdaugh case. And I hope to be back again tomorrow with another recap of day 2. Thanks, and have a fantastic evening. Bye.